Most policy debates about upward mobility focus on things like education, workforce programs, and tax policy, but they ignore what's actually the most important variable that impacts the outcomes for the next generation.
It's really irrefutable in the social science that kids who grow up with the benefit of a two-parent married home, they are just at a tremendous advantage in life.
On this episode, we sit down with economist Melissa Kearney to discuss her new book, The Two-Parent Privilege: How Americans Stopped Getting Married and Started Falling Behind. You're listening to Defending Ideas. Defending Ideas is a weekly podcast produced by Sutherland Institute. On this show, we are committed to renewing the principles of common sense conservatism, making you a better champion of sound ideas. Welcome back to another episode of Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nic Dunn, and this week we're talking about families, and more importantly, the impact that family stability and family structure can have on society and the downstream effect on many policy and political issues we debate in this world that we live in these days. And I'm very excited to introduce our guest. She's Dr. Melissa Kearney. She's a professor of economics at the University of Maryland. She's also a non-resident senior fellow at Brookings, and she has a PhD in economics from MIT. And for the topic for today's discussion, she's the author of the book, The Two-Parent Privilege, that we're going to talk about today, How Americans Stopped Getting Married and Started Falling Behind. Melissa, thank you so much for being with us on Defending Ideas.
Thanks for having me.
I've been really excited about this conversation. I mentioned to you before we started recording that ever since I even heard about this book coming out, I thought this is going to be a really important book. I'm excited to read it, excited to talk to you about it. And so I'm so glad you're here with us today because this seems to be, to me, one of the most important contributions of our time in the realm of public policy and how do we help ensure, good outcomes and opportunities for the next generation. And so I want to thank you for the work you've done and dive into kind of what you're arguing for and maybe talk about how we hope it can make a difference in the way we talk about things in society.
I appreciate that. I'm glad you agree this is an important topic. That's why I wrote the book. It felt really important, but sometimes it also felt just so obvious that, on the one hand, super obvious, on the other hand, super controversial. So it was a bit of a gamble putting it out. So thank you for your kind words.
Well, and I'll just mention an anecdote. I think I've shared it previously on the show, but to really center the importance of this topic, an experience that I had a few years ago, it was right after, soon after I had gotten married and soon after my wife and I found out that we were going to have our first baby. And one of my colleagues at the time at the place I was working, we were in a meeting and he said, Nick, when you think of 10 years from now, what's the first thing that comes to mind? And he was fishing for a public policy answer because that's the industry we worked in. And, previously I probably would have said, well, Utah's economy will look like this. We have to deal with these growth issues or any of those kinds of things. But because I just found out I was going to be a dad, the thing that came to mind was, wait a minute, I'll have a 10-year-old boy by then. Everything changed. And now I thought, okay, everything that I think is important has to be anchored to that truth. And fast forward now, we've got a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old, 2 little boys. And so this idea of the importance of family is personally relevant. And it seems to me that if in our own lives we think, well, the health and well-being of our families, of our kids is the most important thing to me, of course that should be reflected in our public policy. So I just love the approach you've taken that this is important and it matters for our policy discussions.
And I mean, in a similar way, I write the book and I say, I'm a mom and I'm an economist in that order. So I'm an economist who's been studying inequality and poverty and social mobility for over 2 decades now. But I'm a mom, and it's like those two things affect the way I think about this issue, and I think sort of ground me in the reality of, family is the fundamental society, the unit of society. Why don't we write more about economic challenges with that understanding in mind? So it's related, I guess, to the insight you had. Once you became a dad, all public policy is seen through that lens.
Well, let's talk about your writing on this, because we'll include, of course, the link to the book in the show notes. And I'll start off by encouraging everyone to please go out, buy it, read it, think about it deeply, because it's very impactful, both personally and in terms of public policy. And Melissa, I want to start off by reading a passage from the book. This is actually in the tail end of the book as you're wrapping up your conclusion, but I think it sets the tone for your entire argument and what I hope can be our conversation today. You write in The Two-Parent Privilege, "The conventional mores in the United States today are to treat matters of family and family formation with a dedicated agnosticism, avoiding any suggestion that one type of family might be somehow preferable to another family type." You go on to say, "But when I look at the data and evidence that have piled up over decades and across disciplinary fields, I am convinced that it is a conversation people in the U.S. need to have. What those data say overwhelmingly are that children's outcomes in life are profoundly shaped by their family and home experiences." And you talk in particular about the impact of married two-parent households. So with that framing, I just want to ask you, give us your thesis, maybe for someone who is new to this idea as a public policy discussion, or maybe is a little skeptical. What's your core argument that you're trying to persuade people of in your book?
So I think there's really two basic facts that I'm trying to make sure are more widely understood. The first is that it is, and this builds on the passage you just read, it's really irrefutable in the social science that kids who grow up with the benefit of a two-parent married home, they are just at a tremendous advantage in life. That's not to say that everybody should be married. That's not to say that there aren't marriages that, would be detrimental to the people involved in the kids. But on average, it really is irrefutable that that is a very beneficial family structure for kids. And we could talk about that and talk about how social scientists come to that, but that's really irrefutable. In like hundreds of studies at this point, you just see that kids who have the benefit of married parents, two parents in their home, they hit a bunch of sort of success milestones. They're less likely to have behavioral challenges. It's just a very beneficial family structure. So that's a fact that really is undeniable. The second issue is that at a more aggregate level, what has happened in U.S. society over the past 40 years is that we've seen a real divergence in family structure, such that now this very beneficial, advantageous family structure is becoming increasingly concentrated among just the most advantaged, highly educated, high-income groups in society, such that, in particular, outside of the class of adults without a college degree, marriages have declined. Their kids are much more likely to be raised in a one-parent home. Women without a college degree are much more likely to find themselves in the very difficult position of raising their kid without a committed spouse or, co-parent in the home. And this has contributed very mechanically to widening household income inequality in the U.S., and it's contributed to an erosion of social mobility. And so both, you take at the household level, of course, this is a beneficial structure, but I'm trying to, put data behind it so that's not a controversial or a value-laden statement. And then at an aggregate level, the fact that we've had this big divergence across class and racial ethnic groups in society is a real social challenge, undermining the sort of social mobility that so many people would like to see America sort of promise its kids.
Melissa, you mentioned these two things, which the simplified framing of, obviously there's so much depth in your book, but of these 2 points of that married two-parent households are really impactful for kids, and that structure has declined with some kind of class patterns as you've outlined in your book. And I want to get into the second one in a little bit more detail, but first, to that first one of just the impact of married two-parent households on kids. When I think of, okay, what are the things that motivate me in a public policy context? And there are many, but one of them that I always think about is this idea of upward mobility. I mentioned to someone on a previous episode that you could probably boil down the American idea, in my view, to two core things. Number one, it's about protecting your rights, guaranteeing your civil liberties, that you can live your life in accordance with those rights. But number two, it's about protecting this idea of opportunity and upward mobility, that we're going to protect your rights and equip you to earn your success, go and live your life in a way that's successful based on your work and your merit and those kinds of things. that second one of upward mobility, when I hear your arguments and read your book, to me, it suggests that if upward mobility is the thing I care about most, then the place I should focus the most is family, is this idea of married two-parent households. Is that fair to say? We're kind of saying, look, other things like education and workforce programs and all these other things, other variables are important, but the most important is family. Is that right?
Yeah, that's sort of where again, after studying these issues for 25 years, that is where I landed, why I felt like I got to write this book, because I have been in so many policy-oriented conversations that are about how do we address income inequality in this country? How do we expand opportunity? And we talk about schools, the need for a stronger safety net, workforce training, expanded wage subsidies, all these things that I am all for and I've advocated for in policy papers and I think are really important. But when you look at the mounds of evidence, it's like, wait a minute, kids' background, their family background is essentially the most determinative aspect of what their life trajectory looks like. And all of the things that we talk about that are trying to close class gaps, expanded Head Start, subsidized high quality childcare, more support to schools serving under-resourced areas. In some sense, we're swimming upstream because we're trying to fight the symptoms of a breakdown in the two-parent family. And so as a policy matter, I felt like, wait a minute, we need to be doing all that, but let's actually shore up the institution that is most determinant of a kid's trajectory in life. And how do we do that? And we need to, again, because I think the reason why this has gotten short shrift in policy conversations is not because people disagree about the academic evidence, but because it feels like it's outside the policy realm or it's uncomfortable or frankly, we're not really sure what to do about it. But that doesn't mean that's not where really so much of our attention needs to be, to your point. On your specific question of if you care about social mobility, should that be where you're focused? On both an individual level, again, we have mounds of studies showing that at an individual level, kids growing up on average, kids growing up in two-parent, married parent households on average do better. Also, all of this work now coming out of this Opportunity Insights lab at Harvard that has access to millions of records of IRS data, so you track kids over time. That data at a neighborhood level, at an aggregate level, has revealed that the share of households in a neighborhood in the US headed by a two-parent household, a married parent household, that is a very sizable predictor of rates of upward mobility from that neighborhood beyond a child's individual experience. So even at an aggregate level, we're seeing that that's very strongly predictive of rates of upward mobility, much more so than things like EITC exposure or college access or all these other things that tend to dominate the policy conversation. So the short answer to your question is, if you care about social mobility, you absolutely need to be thinking about ways to strengthen families, in particular, outside the college educated class where we've seen a real breakdown of the two-parent family.
So it sounds like you're essentially arguing for this paradigm shift of, hey, what we need to, again, not excluding other conversations about some of these other policy levers you mentioned, and I'm a big fan of the earned income tax credit and a number of other things that can have a positive impact. But if we're doing all those and sort of ignoring family structure and family stability, that you mentioned this upstream idea that there's in previous work I worked on mental health initiatives, and that was an analogy we used all the time, was this upstream metaphor where imagine if you're standing on the bank of a river and you see people floating down the river that are drowning and they're struggling to keep their head above water, and you throw in a life preserver, you jump in to rescue them, and more people come and help you to pull these people out of the river who are on the verge of drowning. But at some point, they say, well, wait a minute, why are so many people falling in the first place? I'm going to go upstream and figure out what's going on and see if I can help prevent people from falling in. And then if others are saying, what are you doing? We need help pulling people out of the river. It's kind of like, well, I'm not saying we shouldn't do this. Yes, but we also need to go upstream.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, it's so obvious once you say it, right? And so then I think it's worth asking, where is the resistance coming from and why haven't we been having this conversation? And there's a few things, and it's been actually really interesting to me to see where I'm getting pushback since the book came out in the fall. one is there's this really interesting tendency of social scientists who are very hung up on, well, is what you're finding causal? They don't want it to be, for some reason, there's like, it's probably not the fact that the parents are married. It's probably something else. So we can show you in the data that it's nothing else observable. Meaning, if you look at kids whose moms are this, have the same level of education or the same race, started childbearing at the same age, live in the same place, kids whose moms are married versus not, they do better. There's an increased likelihood that they graduate high school, avoid poverty, graduate college, all sorts of things. So in the language of social scientists, controlling for the observable things, we still see what I refer to as the marriage premium for kids. Okay, so then people who are really skittish about suggesting it's marriage want to say, well, it's something unobservable about the people who aren't married. So let's think about what that's saying. That's saying, no, people who are single parents are probably deficient in ways that relate to their parenting, in ways we can't observe as researchers, such that even if they had a second parent in the home, contributing a salary, contributing their time, contributing their supervision, their kids would still be at a disadvantage. Like, why? Why would that be your default presumption? I see nothing in the data to suggest that people who are doing a really hard job of parenting their kids by themselves, even if they had all this extra support of a second person, wouldn't be able to deliver these clearly advantageous, resources to their kids. And in fact, if you take this resource-based perspective on the topic, as I do as an economist, actually, we see very clearly that two-parent households have a lot more resources coming into the household. Resources like income, like time, like supervision, like emotional bandwidth, resources that we know are beneficial to kids' development. And so once you do that and take a resource-based perspective, I've written down a model that gives predictions of how we think it might vary with certain situations, and the data supports that. And so I think, some people's skittishness about just not wanting to suggest one family structure is better than another in a well-intentioned effort to be inclusive really actually winds up being extraordinarily insulting when you unpack what it means, right? Because it means actually the parents are at a deficit in ways we can't observe. And it denies, in a way that becomes silly when you try to do it, that all of the resources a second parent would bring to the house, denies the advantages that those brings kids. So that's why I think some people are just skittish about accepting this. The other two lines of pushback I've gotten, the strongest lines of pushback I've gotten in the book, in some sense have surprised me. The people who immediately wrote the most dismissive reviews of the book, sort of in the first 48 hours of it being out, were really feminist or gender reporters who took issue. They said I had the second wave feminists rolling in their graves. They took issue with the idea of what they heard just from the title, suggesting that women can't raise kids on their own just as well as a couple could. And, the more pushback I've gotten from, I'm going to call them so-called feminist writers, the more I've thought that is not a feminist position. As a feminist myself, it bothers me that women with lower levels of education, with less economic security, are so much more likely than those of us who have advanced levels of education to have a committed partner in their house helping them raise their kids. And from an equity perspective, we should want more women having access to a healthy, happy, committed relationship to raise their kids and run a household with. And so I don't know why some of these feminists are sort of really resistant to this idea that, hey, doing this as two people makes the really hard job of parenting easier than doing it as one. And then the third line of, I think, resistance, again, which once you strip it down, I find pretty obnoxious, is from well-meaning progressives who want to say, let's take your upstream, downstream. You know what? The dads of those kids, the dads who aren't living with their kids, they don't even have college degrees. They have all these challenges. Let's sort of give up on them. And what the government needs to do is send more money to single mothers. That doesn't really sound like a great vision for society either. And I think it denies the very real struggles of many men and dads who struggle with lack of employment, who struggle with untreated mental health challenges, who would like to be good fathers and involve fathers to their children. And frankly, in my view, are they should also have more help. And that would benefit the women who would like to have a partner helping them, and it would benefit their kids. And so I think, from a position of empathy, which is where I really come from in addressing this issue, it's silly and counterproductive. And in some sense, I think, not really the empathetic position to deny the benefits of the two-parent household, or to deny why the class-based differences in family structure really should concern all of us concerned with things like equity and social mobility.
Can we drill down for just a second on this resources argument that you've articulated here and you make in your book? And you mentioned this, but I think the underscoring of this distinction is important, that when you say resources, you're not talking about solely money or even solely time. And you list out some of these things, as you've just said, that it's financial resources, that a two-parent household is more likely to have more financial resources for the kids, but also more time. And anyone who's a parent recognizes this, that when I get home from work and my wife and I are talking about, okay, who's going to bathe which child and get them ready for bed and all these kinds of things, who's going to do the dishes. Obviously, having two people there is beneficial. But what I want to drill down to is kind of alluding to what you just articulated as the pushback, that if it was just about resources, then if I were to disappear tomorrow and the government stepped in and said, okay, we're going to give your family a monthly check that's equal to or greater than, which obviously this is an absurd scenario, equal to or greater than the income that I was bringing in, and maybe they're going to have a full-time nanny to help with whatever they need. And so essentially, if you're controlling for these other money and time-based resources aspects, that, like, just to me personally, that'd say, well, to suggest that can 100% replace what I bring to my family is, of course, wrong and offensive. So how do you parse that out to say that, are there other resources that are not accounted for in that kind of thing?
Yeah, so this is critically important. One, to making the case that, like, why do two parents matter? And so again, I take it as a resources framework. You can see in the data, right? Again, any of us who are parents know we do, like, all of the things we do for our kids, and bring money into the household is one of them. But in the data, what do we see? We see that two-parent households, and let me just say on this, in the US context, I sort of go back and forth between whether I'm referring to married parent households or two-parent households, because in the US, a married parent household is really the institution that delivers two parents to kids. There are very few kids in the US growing up with long-term cohabiting two biological parents. So I'm going back and forth between those terms, even though in the book I'm very careful about which one I'm using when based on the data source. But let's just say, okay, what do we know? We know that kids growing up in a single mother household are 5 times more likely to live in poverty than kids growing up in a married parent household. If they live with a single dad, they're 3 times more likely. So just on basic financial income, right? Kids with married parents, they have more income in their households, which is very protective for lots of reasons. If you just look at median household income, it's about twice as high in two-parent households or married parent households than one, because most women work. And so if you have 2 adults in the household, you're likely to have the income of 2 people. So, right. So income is a big one. Now, when we're running our statistical models to try and explain why is it that kids growing up in married parent homes have better outcomes, and what do I mean? Again, things like they avoid poverty, they graduate high school, they graduate college, those kinds of observable outcomes. In a statistical sense, when you control for income, meaning I'm equating income across households, that shrinks the gap in outcomes a little bit, but it doesn't make it go away at all. And in fact, when I look at, the premium, the increased likelihood of kids going, whether they finish a 4-year college degree by the time they're 25, there's like a 28 percentage point gap between kids who, moms have higher level of education, whether they're married or not. If I control for income, that gap only shrinks to 20 percentage points. So income doesn't even explain the bulk of it. Okay. What else do we have data on? We have data on time use. We know that kids who have the benefit of married parents, they get more time with their parents. And parental time is an investment in kids, and it's good for their development and ultimately their outcomes. There's also work that shows the deficits that kids from single parent households experience are smaller if they spend more time with their non-resident dad. So that helps verify that one of the beneficial things from having a second parent around is time spent with them. And the third big bucket of resources that I talk about is it comes under different names in different disciplines. I refer to it as emotional bandwidth. Maybe that's a reflection of how I think about it when I'm a parent and I come home and there's days where I'm just frazzled. And let's say one of my kids is being difficult and I say I'm out because I just don't have the emotional bandwidth to be the nurturing parent that, development psychologists say I should be. And I sort of punt them on my husband. That, even if we managed to send more government checks, have more supportive housing vouchers, have subsidized childcare, all things, let me be clear, I am 100% in favor of to make the deficits that kids from one-parent households experience, because really fundamentally, my main goal is to make sure every kid in this house, in this country, has their needs met and that has the best chance of living their best life. Even if we manage to give more government resources and financial assistance to those households, at the end of the day, having a second person to supervise, to nurture, to take some of the bandwidth off the other parent, all of that you can't replace with a government check. And so government programs aren't going to solve the problem.
Can you speak briefly, you alluded to this a minute ago, but the distinction between married two-parent households and cohabiting two-parent households, there is a distinction in the data in terms of longevity of stability for kids. So can you just emphasize that point real quick?
Yeah, so let me just say at a conceptual level, again, because I come at this topic with the lens of it's a resource-based, marriage is a contract between two people to pool their resources and jointly consume and produce in a long-term contract, right? It's not a romantic view of marriage, but it's a very, very practical institution. And when you think of it in those practical terms, you can see why it's beneficial for kids. All right. So then conceptually, if you have two parents who don't have the legal arrangement, but essentially promise each other and carry through on that promise to pool their resources and live together through their, child's life and take care of them jointly, then in my conceptualization of this issue, you wouldn't have a difference in kids' outcomes. What we see in the data is that basically there's huge differences between whether kids are living with married parents or not. And part of the reason is because even though some of the non-married parents will cohabit, cohabitation in the US among parents is a very fragile arrangement. We could speculate as to why that is. It could reflect something about the fragility of the relationship from the very beginning, which is why they're in a cohabiting situation. But only 8% of kids in the US Census live with one of their biological parents and a second parent figure. And that second parent figure, in about 40% of the cases, isn't even the child's second biological parent. It might just be their mother or father's boyfriend or girlfriend, which, by the way, those are some of the most dangerous situations for kids. And so it's not the case that I should put more specific numbers on this. At this point, only 63% of kids in the US are living with married parents. 21% of them are living with an unpartnered mother. About 4.5% are living with an unpartnered father. And so then you get, this 8% living with cohabiting, one biological parent and a cohabiting parent. If you look at the dynamics of how many of those couples will stay together, the number of kids living in a cohabiting situation is even smaller. But I do think it's important to note too, in many of those situations, again, it's not even their parents. They're two biological parents who are cohabiting. This is a distinction worth making because in Europe, the situation is different. So for example, in France, you have a very large number of share of children born outside of marriage, but fewer children ultimately are growing up in single parent homes because there's a social norm that's much stronger about parents in long-term cohabiting arrangements that just isn't, as a practical matter, present in the U.S.
In your book, you describe in detail this sort of diverging trend line, or diverging trend lines, rather, of the decline in marriage, specifically with kids being raised in households. And you've mentioned it a couple times. Can you give a little more detail on the difference we're seeing, that these declining marriage rates, it's not hitting all Americans equally. In fact, it's concentrated.
Yeah, this is, I think, why this is such a big story and needs to be more widely appreciated. So if I just look at what's happened over the past 40 years, which is really the focus of my book from, 1980 to 2000, what's the last year? I think I stop it right before the pandemic. So you've got, basically, it used to be that if I just look at kids whose moms have a 4-year college degree, in 1980, 90% of them were living in married parent homes. That's only fallen 6 percentage points. So now it's 84% of kids whose moms have a 4-year college degree are living in married parent homes. I want to pause on that because the share of moms with a college degree has really exploded. This is a much less selective group, more varied group than in the past, and yet still marriage among highly educated moms is holding very, very strong. Among the least educated mothers, the most economically disadvantaged, let's take mom with less than a high school degree. Back in 1980, it was 73% of them were living with married parents. Now that's down to 57%. Very, very low. Okay. I think people have in mind that women with less than a high school degree, many of them would have initiated childbearing as teenagers. It's not surprising that there's low rates of marriage among those mothers. What I think is really underappreciated is how much marriage has declined for the middle group, moms with a high school degree, maybe some college, but not a 4-year college degree. Among them, the decline in the share of their kids living with married parents fell over these 4 decades from 83% to 60%. That's massive, a 23 percentage point decline in the share of kids living with married parents among children whose moms have a high school degree, but not a 4-year college degree. That is, let's think of them as the middle class. The middle class, their family structure has converged down so that moms with a high school degree now are basically just as likely as moms without a high school degree to be raising their kids as single moms, as unpartnered mothers. There was no reason back in 1990 that I think any of us would have predicted that the middle educated group would have converged down instead of up. And that's really what's driving the overall decline. But it's also led to what I call this college gap in family structure. We know from lots of studies and public rhetoric and articles that the college educated workers over the past 4 decades in the US have done extremely well. Their employment has stayed high. Their earnings have increased. They've sort of pulled away economically from non-college educated adults. And both a cause and consequence of that, right? You've got this divergence in family structure. And so again, like this divergence in family structure has amplified inequality in the US and led to this really large class gap in household economic security and children's opportunities for upward mobility.
What do you see driving those trend lines? Is there just something about going to college that you get there and while you're there, hey, I think I'd like to get married and have kids? Like, well, why is it so distinct with those groups?
Okay, I am not inclined to think that college-educated adults are just more likely to fall in love or somehow have relationships that are happy every day, right? And so there's got to be some other factors at play here. Ultimately, what I conclude, again, from lots of research, some my own, others, that I've read from other people and really dug into, at the end of the day, the answer is it's both economics and social, okay? So what do I mean by that? Let's start with the economic contributors here. College-educated workers have done really well. When you take this economic lens to marriage, the institution of marriage, the attractiveness of getting married and committing to a partner is higher, or it's maintained, let's say from the perspective of the women to start. If you can depend upon that, I'm taking a very heteronormative framework of marriage here. You've got, a man who you can depend on to have steady employment and bring in high earnings. Marriage is now an attractive financial institution. If you are a man and you can be reliable, you can be confident that you're going to have a steady job and able to support a family, marriage is a more attractive institution. So just the economic value proposition of marriage has been maintained for college educated workers, college educated adults. And we see, again, marriage rates are pretty high among that group. Outside that class, what's happened over the past 40 years is men's economic position, both in an absolute sense and relative to women, has eroded. And we see in a causal sense that there's this causal link between economic shocks that have eroded men's economic position, men without a college degree. I'm thinking about things like the adoption of technology and industrial robots in communities that were heavily invested in the technologies that in the industries that use these technologies, import competition from China that eliminated some manufacturing jobs in certain communities. We see in those affected communities, men are more likely to lose their jobs. They're more likely to have lower earnings, both in an absolute sense and relative to women with their education levels. And we see marriage rates decline and the share of kids living with only their mother increase, right? So this is the marriageable men hypothesis attributed to William Julius Wilson in the 1980s, who at the time was writing about what was emerging as a divergence in family structure between Black and white Americans. He said, Black men were less likely to be employed, more likely to, sort of be unemployed, incarcerated for all sorts of structural reasons, discrimination. But he was using that to explain why there was this gap. And I think what we've seen in the past 40 years is you can think about that framework in a class-based way. So that's the economics. The social changes that have made non-marital childbearing, single-parent households much more socially acceptable and common, the erosion of the marital contract that has made marriage a less reliable, binding institution, all of those have also pushed in this direction of moving people away from the institution of marriage, being much more likely to have children outside of a marital union. And so now you've got this confluence of economic and social changes reinforcing each other, again, primarily outside the college-educated class.
A couple examples you mentioned in your book to kind of drive home this point you're making, that it's both economics and culture, social norms combined, is you compare the coal boom in the 70s and the fracking boom in the early 2000s. And we've seen some of that here in Utah, especially the Uinta Basin region of Utah, which is east of Salt Lake City, has been kind of on a boom and bust cycle in previous years with respect to natural gas, with hydraulic fracturing. And so elements of sort of these economic trends hit close to home for us here in Utah. But can you walk through sort of those two phenomena, I guess, in terms of economic trends and how that sheds light on this as maybe kind of a rebuttal to the folks who say, well, see, all you got to do is it's economic, it's policy, it's money. Those are the things. Those two examples show that it's actually more than that, right?
I confess 10 years ago, I was on a panel and I said, look, what we need to do is bring back, well-paying jobs for non-college educated men. I really pushed this economic line. And then I wrote a study. I did a study with Riley Wilson, who was a graduate student at Maryland at the time. Now he's on the faculty of BYU. We wrote a paper together looking at the fracking boom in the U.S. in the early 2000s. We eliminate from our sample North Dakota and South Dakota. We know that was a different situation. You had a bunch of migrants coming in. But all around the country, all these communities, largely rural communities, they had the geological capability of making use of this new sort of cheap technology, fracking. What do we look? We see in the data that this increased employment among men without a college degree. It increased their earnings, both in an absolute sense and relative. And so we were excited to test the reverse marriageable men hypothesis. Hey, these non-college educated men are doing well. We should see an increase in marriage and a reduction in the non-marital childbearing. What the data revealed was absolutely no share of the kids being born outside wedlock and no increase in marriage. But there was an increase in births. So there was an increase in income in these towns. People had more kids. That's consistent with other evidence that when there's a positive income shock, one of the things people do is spend the money on having kids. Kids are expensive. Okay. But they were no more likely to have kids whether they were married or not. So this was a surprise. Okay. This showed an asymmetry. So then we compared what happened. We looked back at the coal boom and bust period in the 70s and 80s. So you had a very similar shock to men's employment and earnings in very similar communities. And there, what we saw in the data was when there was, an increase in coal prices, an increase in some coal producing areas, men's earnings went up, marriage rates went up, and the share of kids born outside wedlock fell. Okay. And so what is this consistent with? It's consistent with a very similar shock, 40 years apart, leading to very different family formation responses consistent with the social paradigm of the time. And we can dig in further to when we see in the fracking period, the places where non-marital fertility increased more in response to the fracking boom were in places that already had higher baseline levels of non-marital fertility. I think this will feel intuitive to people in the sense of the social norms where you live sort of govern how you respond to things. And so back in the 80s, if you wanted to have kids, you basically did that inside marriage. That was the socially acceptable way to do it. In the 2000s, in many of these communities, it was already quite common and quite socially acceptable to have kids outside marriage. And so when men were employed and they had more money, maybe, a cohabiting couple or a couple engaged in a loose relationship decided to have a kid, and there wasn't this sort of commitment to being married first.
So I want to transition into in the couple minutes that we have left, what to do about all of this, and in terms of solutions or next steps as a society, as a country. I know there will be some voices saying, well, we have to reform government programs, we have to invest in different areas, and some of those make sense. One of them actually that you mentioned in your book as well is sort of pushing back against this argument of welfare programs and being the primary culprit of disincentivizing marriage. And you articulate that a lot of that was dealt with in the 1996 welfare reform legislation. So if you want to touch on that briefly, but then after that, let's get into what other things would you want to see happen?
Well, these questions are related in the sense that the way forward or the way to address this is to not make the safety net even more stingy, such that life in the U.S. for single mothers is even worse financially, under this misguided idea that that's going to turn things around. So the point I make in the book is, even if in the 60s and 70s, the creation of the AFDC, the AFDC program, which had been around since the 30s, but by the 60s and 70s, it was basically only going to never married women. It explicitly said you couldn't get the money, any cash welfare, if you had a man in the house, if you were married. You lost your benefits as soon as you went to work. I mean, all of the incentives were bad. So we can talk about, what did that do? And it turns out the empirical evidence is it led to some small increase in non-marital fertility, but quite small, actually. But in any case, in 1996, we reformed welfare. We tightened it up. Cash benefits are very meager. Now it's really a lot of our redistribution comes through the earned income tax credit, which is you have to work. And so we're not going to increase self-sufficiency by making cash welfare even stingier in this country. So that's a big point I want to make. So what do I think needs to happen? I mean, part of my book really is admitting as an economist, it's not going to be economic tinkering, right? And so it's not economic tinkering, which is maybe part of the reason why economists just haven't been forthcoming enough about the importance of this issue, is because we don't have here, just enact this economic policy and things will change. It's going to take big changes. All of the things that we talk about to try and improve the economic security of workers without a college degree takes on heightened urgency when you realize that the employment instability and the limited earnings of non-college educated men have had these spillover effects on the family and kids. Okay, so that's a big policy agenda. It's going to be necessary but not sufficient to increase the economic security of many of these dads, quite frankly. But then I also think that needs to go hand in hand with a social, cultural honesty and recognition that we're not doing our kids any favors by pretending that the decline in two-parent families isn't tremendously consequential in a way that's disadvantaged millions of children in this country. So we need to be honest about that. Leaders need to be honest about that. Trusted religious leaders need to be honest about that. People who mentor young children need to be honest about that. Here's where we move away from the kinds of things that I know how to do as an economist. But what I do know as an economist and social scientist is that role models matter. Media messages matter. All those sorts of messages should be very, very explicit to young people. Actually, it does matter how you raise your kids. It does matter whether they have the benefits of two parents in the household. And so, being honest about that and thinking about ways of spreading that message and getting that across, I think could help. I think there are also, what we know from ethnographic research and qualitative surveys of couples who avail themselves of the limited programs that are there to help, build healthy relationships among low-income couples. There are a lot of couples who want to make it work. Who would want to parent by themselves if they had the option of a healthy, rewarding relationship with your child's other parent, right? So there are a lot of couples who want to achieve that, but face real barriers. And I don't think we should refrain from publicly funding, philanthropically funding programs that are actually aimed at helping people achieve stable relationships, healthy marriages. I think we need to be experimenting with that and spending a lot more of our money and our time and our research energy figuring out ways to help strengthen families.
Melissa, as we wrap up, just to put a fine point on this final question, you're in an elevator and in walks the President of the United States, House and Senate leadership, and the governor of Utah, legislative leadership, let's say Hollywood leadership, major media, whatever other civic institutions. It's a very big elevator. They all come on like, hey, Dr. Kearney, we've read your book. We really like it. We got 30 seconds before we get off the elevator. What's the one big thing we should focus on right now?
I got to work on my elevator pitch, but what Congress should do is authorize a lot more money to the Administration for Children and Families dedicated specifically to programs aimed at strengthening families. Okay, we spend way more money on child support enforcement, on foster care, on Head Start. Spend money on programs aimed at strengthening families and test them, figure out what works, and then expand them. Hollywood media leaders, look at your programming. Look at whether your inclination to celebrate non-traditional families has come at the expense of being honest about, one, that marriage isn't, it's not perfect every day. Like showing examples of couples who struggle and yet are still there for their kids. Like maybe we can have some more programming about that. And when you do have sort of non-traditional families, maybe be clear about how difficult it is. Like just more honesty in your programming.
Well, the book is The Two-Parent Privilege, How Americans Stopped Getting Married and Started Falling Behind. We'll include them in the show notes. Go buy it, go read it, think about it, and talk about it with your friends and family and elected officials. And the author is Dr. Melissa Kearney. Thank you so much for sharing your time and expertise with us here on Defending Ideas.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, we have one more quick break before we leave you with some final talking points. This is Defending Ideas. Stick around. We'll be right back.
Sometimes it's hard to keep up with the latest policy debate that affects your life. The solution? Subscribe to Sutherland Institute's weekly newsletter, where you'll find in-depth insights from seasoned policy experts, compelling multimedia, and advance notice of special events. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. Before we go, there's a few thoughts that I captured, trying to boil down that whole excellent conversation with Melissa into a few talking points that we can use in our conversations if we find ourselves discussing with somebody the importance of the family as an institution of civil society and how family structure and family stability are actually upstream of most, maybe all, or certainly a lot of our public policy challenges that we face in this country today. And I think there are really 3 points that I want to emphasize if you find yourself in one of these conversations. Number one, start out by articulating that we care deeply about opportunity for the next generation, about upward mobility for kids who are growing up today, which means that we want every child in America to grow up in an environment that gives them the best shot at having a happy, healthy, successful life as they become an adult. Number two, that means that because of that, we recognize that the evidence is overwhelming that family, the family structure, family environment, family stability is the most important variable that's going to impact these outcomes for kids later in life. And number three, because of that, the data is clear that a married two-parent household, on average, it gives the best foundation for these kids to, again, have a happy, healthy, successful life as adults. And that means that all of us should rally around that being a goal that we pursue in policy conversations, but also in our social conversations. What are the social and cultural norms that can help support that institution and that structure and stability being available to as many kids growing up in this country as possible? Well, we hope that you've enjoyed this episode and that you feel better equipped to discuss and defend some of the ideas we talked about today. If you liked what you heard, please visit defendingideas.org. From there, you can access all of our previous episodes. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel and also subscribe on any of the podcast platforms wherever you get your shows, Apple, Spotify, all the major platforms. Just search for Defending Ideas and click subscribe. And if you do subscribe to the Sutherland Institute YouTube channel, make sure you click the little bell icon in the corner so you get notified each time a new episode drops, which is every Tuesday morning. So again, that's defendingideas.org. And if you want to support the broad work of Sutherland Institute, conversations like this, and research and policy initiatives to make a difference for Utahns and Americans, please visit sutherlandinstitute.org/donate. That'll do it for this episode of Defending Ideas. Thanks so much for being with us. From the Sutherland Institute in Salt Lake City, I'm Nic Dunn. We'll see you next time.